Good afternoon. I'm wearing what would be my formal winter jacket, at least as appropriate here. Maybe climate's a little further north. Does it seem a bit out of place, especially since it says right now it's 92 degrees outside? Yes, it is. Nonetheless, my state of mind right now tells me that for what I'm about to discuss, this is actually the appropriate attire. Is that a time space dislocation? Is that a geo positioning? Is it a concept that somehow there are intrinsic or inherent values in the context under which I actually obtained this coat, which, by the way, I received on Christmas Eve? And what I tried to do in this coat, by the way, I was wearing this coat when I ended up having to file a report. Let's put it that way, right? And that brings up the topic of at hand here, which right now I have up before me what was logged in evidence already, which are two reports that are provided by the Congressional Research Service. There were a series of reports that were produced by the Congressional Research Service last year. And what I had been doing for a while is tracking how I believe that reports issued by the Congressional Research Service are ones that have a lot of inherent value in them. It may even be very important, if not benchmarks in situations concerning accrual accounting for the federal government. Also, a form of security document that has very significant implications for the United States. And I spent several months actually trying to compile a system to track them with an understanding that meeting benchmarks associated with those reports and following up on the content of those reports was actually the kind of work that Congress is supposed to be doing. And it's the kind of work that various federal agencies are supposed to be doing as part of the federal budget process, right? And as part of assuring our fiscal responsibility. Even if we commission a report and it's based on fact, then there are obligations that are attendant with that report. There was yesterday a 1 year anniversary on a Congressional Research Service report regarding the United States Mexico Canada Agreement, the USMCA. Now, I've had problems with the USMCA since I received a notification in my email from a senator from the state of Texas, as opposed to a direct communication in response to concerns I had contacted him about directly, discussing how there was going to be a period that was to take place over the summer 2017 regarding public comment on changes to NAFTA that were then pending, and that this was to involve people within the United States and outside of the United States. But this was concerning to me for a number of reasons. The first of which was that in the public library in Houston, I encountered a book that had a very comprehensive explication of NAFTA. It was the specifics of the agreement, and one of the things that I understood was that NAFTA had a very specific methodology when it came to evaluating considerations of labor support in across border matters. And the terms for the United States with Canada were different than the terms for the United States and Mexico. And one of the things it discussed very specifically was the consideration of trade representatives from countries besides the United States. Trade representatives from Mexico and trade representatives from Canada. And my concern was that they were a specific implication, that there was something more to the consideration of trade representative than, for instance, somebody that would have been licensed as a customs broker, or somebody that would have been involved in finance, and or even somebody that may have been in some sort of, shall we say, downstream sort of enterprise. But it also had a very specific matter related to it in the event that there was a strike within the United States. It was identified as a strike from the perspective of a labor management point of view, and whether to be a large-scale general strike or some sort of large-scale labor matters that were to be engaged by American workers. Then there were specific elements of NAFTA that spoke to what would be permitted and what would be the terms for permitting workers from outside of the United States to come to the United States. Now, I was perusing this. I found this information at the end of 2016 and reviewed it again around February 2017. I also attempted to see it again around June or July of 2017. It was in a specific hardbound book that was identified as a reference book in the library in Houston. Now, I've not been in Houston for a while, and I've not seen that specific publication. But in the course of these things happening and what I had been experiencing around that time, I was very concerned about the lack of more forthright examination and implications associated with the alleged public comment period when it came to whatever the changes to NAFTA were being. Not only that, but there had also been a situation where, in the course of having to deal with the matters that were ongoing at that period of time, I contended that there were a lot of outstanding issues related to NAFTA that had not been addressed. And in the course of the manner in which they were going to discuss or try to codify this public comment period, there was a lot that was not being shared with the people within the United States. Remember now, a lot of different things happened in 2017. And part of what was going on in Texas in 2017 is there was a review of the State Bar of Texas before the Sunset Commission, which is a legislative process that is mandated in consideration of certain state entities that were authorized by the legislature. They have to go through periodic review in order to have their charters renewed by the state. The State Bar of Texas, or rather the Texas Bar Association and the State Bar of Texas, were under such a review during 2017. And one of the things that had happened is that the State Bar of Texas, the Executive Committee of the State Bar of Texas, had provided a report as part of the review process that gave very specific information about the composition of the State Bar of Texas and lawyers that were licensed to practice law. And there were very, very alarming aspects of information in there, including the composition of people who identified their race or ethnicity in the membership of the state bar. There was a very significant percentage that did not identify. But for those that did identify, the statistics connected to lawyers that identified as African American or Asian or specifically Hispanic were very, very small. And one of the things that happened is it discussed how within a 10-year period, the percentage of women, for instance, had doubled, but still represented a very, very minor percentage of the overall membership of the State Bar of Texas. And they were discussing this within a 10-year period. And within that period, my concern became, well, who was involved with the crafting of the original NAFTA? This was a very specific and immediate concern I had at the time. At the time, there's no one with whom to talk about it. If there were so few Hispanic lawyers in the State Bar of Texas itself, who were the people that were actually involved with brokering NAFTA? And insofar as we're talking about a treaty, including a treaty that would have covered a variety of legal matters, including, by the way, would have had a material implication in cross-border legislative efforts that also include task force, that also include a number of other matters specific to the state of Texas. Well, who was involved? And insofar as that's the case, the question then became, well, we have this public comment period. Who was going to be able to comment? And what does it mean to actually provide a public comment? And I've been in a situation for the last 2 years where I had provided public comments to a number of federal agencies, but I'd also provided federal comments to the Federal Reserve Board. And the majority of the reason why I was providing public comments is because I had filed reports with government agencies, including government agencies that opened report numbers and just refused to get back to me. And even insofar as one could say, well, if the report is pending and we can't get back to you by law, that's actually not the truth. Because many of these agencies are also, by law, required to meet certain standards in order to qualify for the terms related to the surety or the insurance, or in connection with actual legislative processes that specifically identify timeframes where there has to be a response. And this was also concerning to me because at the beginning of 2017, there was a report that was released that said that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services had identified that they had a backlog of Medicare claims, Medicare fraud claims, that was so extensive that they had not even gotten to claims that had been filed within the last 3 years. And this was during a time frame wherein the United States had a policy where if you were trying to contract with the government, you had to reveal any allegations or charges of fraud and the results of those investigations within the last 3 years in order to contract. Now, this was something that was proposed as part of an appropriations package during the term of Barack Obama for implementation into law that never got passed. But it was in effect via an executive order. And it was in effect via executive order until it was retracted via executive order under Donald Trump. But we right now, and including during the time frame, which was supposed to be the public comment for NAFTA and what was ever to be the changes to NAFTA, we're in a period where that 3-year term was in effect. And I contend that the USMCA was part of a contrivance that was premeditated from the onset, and that what it belies is a sort of kind of manner in which the crypto economy has gone too far. And there was actually an article that was published in May of 2017, specifically dated for and put into publication on May 11th, 2017 in the Houston Press. It discussed how people in the Texas gas and oil sector were upset with Donald Trump regarding things that were going on with the pending changes to NAFTA and what would later be called the USMCA. Well, the problem with these things is that nobody followed up on that. And at that time, there was already a pending 1-year claim about how somebody had been retaliated against in manners that were directly connected to, among other things, trying to report to the Texas Veterans Commission, as well as others, how people in public office were abusing their office and setting up a situation to provide terms of illegal indebiture to people who were children of members of the military. Now, I'm 44 years old, and my entire adult life has been completely conspired against in order to aid and abet a scheme associated with using me by virtue of the fact that my father was in the military as part of highly illegal activity. I never signed up for the military. I never agreed to engage in any sort of conspiratorial, criminal, or other activity in order to serve in anybody's interest, up to and including somebody alleging that they are in public office and are hence authorized to engage in some sort of clandestine activities. And what I found instead is that there have been changes to the laws, specifically in Texas, but also in other states, that I contend were allowed to go into effect in flagrant violation of the state constitution in order to dispossess people of their federal constitutional rights and allow for unfair advantages to be accorded to people that allege that they're in a public service role, including up to and including a representative of government when identified as being elected, regardless of whether or not they actually were. And these go all the way back to, that I've been able to find, September of 2001, when they went into effect in September of 2001, specific to the Texas Insurance Code. These matters were the kinds of things that would have needed to have been actually addressed in any sort of legitimate public comment period. And what instead happened is it seems to have occurred, is a sort of ceding to this process of allowing for people in Congress to masquerade as if somehow they have the coverage with our credit and with our lives to play at being gangster, to play at being, except they're not playing. And what we've had changes to legislation that do not directly correlate with the USMCA that materially alter the political context around which members of the USMCA or NAFTA would have been implicated. And then there's the consideration of, well, what would have happened in terms of understanding that the same timelines that were necessitating a renegotiation of NAFTA were also pending regarding CAFTA. And now we are more than 3 years down the road, more than 4 years down the road from that public comment period, and we're several years into this illusion of the USMCA. Now, this report had its anniversary yesterday. I had not looked at it yesterday on par with or in regards to something of that sort. What I did do is I returned to high school, and there's evidence of that on my YouTube video, on my YouTube channel. And I would not have approved what ended up happening. And one of the things that's not been made public is that I have evidence, and I identified and relabeled the evidence. I insofar as same evidence can be used to prove multiple charges, that I identified yesterday before 3 o'clock p.m., which would have been before 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time, specific pieces of evidence I have that could, on one matter or another, potentially be considered something that could be a form of security for a community, or could be used in actual financing or support for the actual economic stability of a community, or could actually be evidence of crime, which is what unfortunately now they are. And what has happened is a huge logjam and bottleneck of what has turned into evidence of crime because there was no actual attending to what was crime. And so, we're a year and a day after this July 27, 2020 report regarding the status of the USMCA provided by the Congressional Research Service. But what do we get the next day? Well, there is a 1-year anniversary today on another report by the Congressional Research Service. Mexico, organized crime and drug trafficking organizations. Dated for July 28, 2020. Now, here's the problem. We never dealt with the crime yesterday. Now we want to talk about organized crime and drug trafficking organizations. Who are these trafficking organizations? Well, in the table of contents, it lists right here 9 major drug trafficking groups. We got 9. We got 9. How did we get 9? Is that your baseball team? I think it is. One of the public comments I have with the Federal Reserve has to do with derivative agreements. As a matter of fact, the first public comment I ever made to the Federal Reserve had to do with derivative agreements. And what has been very apparent to me is that the Office of Foreign Asset Control, in conspiracy with the Department of Justice, has been operating a program where they use derivative kingpin designations. I have noticed myself on this list of derivative kingpin designations that's specifically within the last 5 years, that there are people who are removed from consideration as a kingpin on days that correlate with what would have been my efforts to submit reports to the government for crime. And usually this crime had to do with acts of public corruption. Somebody stole what should have been used in the service of the people to prosecute actual criminals within this country, co-conspiring to undermine our safety as some form of insurance to recharacterize whoever they're using as their derivative cover-up. It just so happens that we're in this situation where we're dealing with a default on the refusal of Congress to pass a bill regarding the status of federal workers' compensation and benefits, which they were required to do by the end of August in 2018, and they just didn't do. It goes with the time when the Federal Reserve in 2017 discontinued compiling statistics as part of a labor index. That is actually data. That is actually wealth. That is actually currency. Why did they not want a labor index as part of that which would be considered a part of our economy? These are two things that Congress authorized and allowed to happen without telling us about it prior to the onset of COVID-19, but also during a time when there was a refusal to actually address and prosecute crime that was happening, including on the end user level. When it came to administration of public services, including and especially public services financed by the Health and Human Services, but also public services financed by other entities that would have been associated with and through the Department of Homeland Security under the auspices of emergency prevention or emergency services. As several actions happened in the last 10 years that allowed for civilian service providers of social welfare programs within the United States to be put under the direct oversight of the Department of Homeland Security. And I say oversight because oversight has a very specific legal implication, and it is actually not ambiguous at all, especially when we're talking about the Department of Homeland Security. And in the course of this, I contend that there has been a substantial abuse of the alleged role of the Department of Homeland Security in efforts to try to entice or extort people into habituation to patterns of behavior that aid and abet illegal activity, up to and including drug trafficking. And instead, what we've seen is that we have allowed for the replacement of political rights with access to mind-altering substances, including in manners that we expect the government to pay for. And the question becomes, well, how do they pay for it? because we're the government. And it is disappointing that after 4 years of attempted redress, that my precision and my capabilities all end up getting consolidated into being right on. You know what I could do to these 9 organizations today if I wasn't in a situation where my entire life was supposed to be capitulated to getting people access to CBD oil? If we actually have a threat, see, we have many people in this country that have been strategically imported in waves that directly correlate with acts of pension fraud associated with primarily municipal or other large-scale security issues by the same people. It's the same banks, it's the same brokerages, it's the same material interest, up to and including announcements in the media from alleged politicians, the same politicians, by the way, on the date of their issue that also correlate with these announcements of the humanitarian crisis regarding migration to the United States. Well, why are they fleeing? Is it because of drug and gang violence? Why are we paying for drug dealers? Why are we paying for drug dealers? Why are we paying pension benefits to people whose job it was to eliminate the threat of drug dealers and apparently did not do their job in over 35 years? This is a very serious question. And the problem is because we're not honestly tackling those issues domestically and holding people accountable, because we use access to our pension benefits and what they've allowed to be recapitulated as some form of workers' rights, then what ends up happening is we take the short sell and all of this ends up happening. So all of these people we've been importing, what are we doing with them? How many of these people that are being imported are being used as somebody else's property that they trade, including trade through real-time transactions that happen as part of automated clearinghouses that are the social service provider centers they have to go to in order to get their resource needs met? Or do you prefer that they just all be corralled in somebody's private ranch designation where they're all lined up and they're all serialized, and then somebody just runs an inventory and selects whatever percentage they need, including with specific specifications, so that they can run their commerce on them for as long as they have a timeshare, and when they're done, they just dump them. And if they happen themselves to be cognizant of some of the elements of the tax waiver or the severance tax, well, then you can tell them that they're making a disturbance and that there's a problem with their behavior, and they're going to have to modify their behavior, which most likely in the economy we've created is going to involve them paying a kickback to the gas and oil sector in the form of a derivative product provided through the pharmaceutical sector. Is that why, when it came to yesterday's discussion of the USMCA, under the NAFTA overview, key NAFTA provisions, trade trends, number 1, trade in oil and gas. How much trade in oil and gas do we actually do with Canada and Mexico? When are we going to talk about carbon offset credits? When are we going to talk about military vehicles and the special tax exemption for cross-border traffic? I'm sorry, do you want to talk about drug trafficking organizations? I do too. I have been for a considerable amount of time.